Perio was one of those things where there was this wall of Perio wasn't that important. My gums have always bled. My parents have, it was one of those things where it wasn't a logical thing to get past. So that was one of the passions for me to get past. But it's so easy because now it's a language that our patients can understand. They understand that over bleeding points and suppuration and pocket depths. But classifying those quadrants so that we can bill, so that we can get paid, so that we're consistent, so that no matter who the hygienist is and no matter who the doctor is, we can all get on the same page. If you're an orange grower and you squeeze an orange but you're not using the full force to squeeze it, you're leaving juice in there. All right? For me, I'm squeezing that juice out. I'm selling the seeds to a seed company. I'm selling the rinds to somebody who makes potpourri or whatever. I'm getting every bit I can out of a patient, and I'm going to do that within that hour appointment.
Yeah, this is a tale, oh yeah, a tale of two hygienists. So there might be only one, bringing the best of dental knowledge, and we do it all with ease. We cover oral health and screening, and preventing gum disease. We're gonna do a lot of learning, and have a little bit of fun working at the dentist. A tale of two hygienists.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A Tale of Two Hygienists, episode number 332. I am your host, Andrew Johnston, and thank you so much for making us a part of your day. So we have a good show for you today with Andre Shirdan coming back to talk to us about Perio protocol. He really has an inclusive mindset. I really love where he's coming from, and so he shares some really amazing tips that you and your office could probably pick up and implement today. Next week, we have Dr. Sam Shimardi on. You might remember him from episode 273. And when he came on, he spoke a lot about the occupational hearing loss and what we can do and why it's such a problem. He was fantastic. We got a lot of great feedback from that. And so he'll be joining us again next week. This time when he comes back, though, he has different types of information, different nuggets that he's going to share with us. But I think it's mostly on finances. But the problem with that is, like, as usual, I've taken us down lots of little rabbit holes, and we kind of went around trying to get to the main point on some of these things. And so I really, truly appreciate his and really all of our guests when they're so patient with me when that happens. And you, the listener, for listening to that experience that we have. What else? So I want to wish a belated happy birthday to Michelle Strange and Lacey Walker. They have both been a huge part of the success of this podcast for several years. And so I just hope that they had the very, very, very best of days. Michelle actually turned the big 40 this year. And I was thinking about like this intro and what I wanted to say about it. And every year, if you've been with us for a long time, you know that I've kind of given her like that annual discussion where I kind of was like making fun of her for being so much older than me, even though I think it's like 14 months or so. So she's not that much older, but it was always fun. And then she'd throw it back at me and we kind of, kind of dig at each other a little bit. And that bickering back and forth was really, I don't know. I loved it. I thought it was fun. So, I mean, dang, I missed that this year. So, good times. But yeah, belated happy birthday to both of you. I also, for fun, I made a list, and let me get the list out here in just a second, but I made a list for you, Michelle Strange, just in case you happen to be listening to the show still. And I looked at some of the people that share the same day, not the same birth year, but the same day of birthday with you. And you have people like, and I remember you telling me actually one time, Stephen Colbert was your birthday, co-birthday, whatever you call it. Stevie Wonder is, Darius Rucker, Lena Dunham. Some pretty good people. But then you also have Dennis Rodman. There was like this musician guy, I think he was a country music person, and he had this really cool mullet. There were a lot of YouTubers. There are a ton of TikTokers, which I know that's your favorite. The interesting thing about like the YouTubers, TikTokers, and also there are some rappers, they all only went by one name, which I thought was kind of weird. So you are in great company there, buddy. But yes, I hope you had a great birthday. I don't have a great transition for this next part on my list of things to talk about, but if you could please head over to our sister podcast, Un Cuento de Dos Higienistas. It's hosted by our friend Amber Levados. It's a great podcast. I really think that anyone that has any interest in learning Spanish should be listening to it. And I think that If you are Spanish speaking, then you're going to get a lot of great information there. So please go check them out as well and tell your friends. I think that's it again for this intro. I know it's a little bit shorter. If you have any suggestions for this show, we do have several episodes lined up for the next probably 6 weeks or so. But if you have suggestions of people that you would like to have on or topics you want us to discuss, please send them our way. Email me, andrew@ataleoftwohygienists.com. Also, you can connect with us on social media anytime. A special thank you to Tameka Lee for guest co-hosting with me on this particular episode. You're going to hear from her again, actually, also next week. And then also thank you to Andre for his time and efforts. So please sit back. I hope you enjoy this episode with Andre Shirdan.
A tale of two hygienists.
Welcome, everyone, to the interview portion of the podcast. We're joined today by Andre Shirdan. Now, Andre, he has been on the show before. I'm going to tell you a little something, Andre. You took a chance on this baby podcast, episode number 26.
Wow.
The one that you're going to be released on this time is going to be, I believe, number 332.
Wow.
Isn't that insane? Well, thank you for, it's like back then was it 2016, for taking a chance on us. I appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, audience, if you do go back and you listen to that episode number 26, I also want to just make a little caveat. Andre, your voice, golden. My voice, Michelle's voice was terrible. I think we tried to call in to GoToMeeting and all sorts of other things. It was the most embarrassing thing to go back and listen to that. So maybe let's just have the listeners not go back to that, and we'll replace this episode with the one that's on your website. It'll be a lot better, I think. We're joined also today by Tameka Lee. Thank you so much, Tameka, for being here.
You're welcome. I went back and listened to that episode, and big difference, Andrew.
Oh yeah, it's cringeworthy, wasn't it? So it's why we have all the protocols that we have today. But anyway, so Andre, so I would like a couple of things from the last episode to kind of come forward to this episode. The thing that I really love about you is you and I actually both come from retail backgrounds. I think you're a little bit more high-end retail than what I was doing, but I feel like we learned so much from retail that we can apply now into dentistry. But if you don't mind just kind of going, what got you into dentistry and where you came from?
Yeah. Well, everybody knows, or a lot of people know, that my background is in retail, but it was in really high-end retail. I sold couture clothing. And I'll tell you, you didn't know this, but I started in retail selling shoes at a $9.99 shoe store. It was the original dollar store of shoes. And the volume of retail that I did there was so different than when I switched into high end. I mean, sometimes I would go a week without having a customer. But when I did, I was selling them, $4,000 or $5,000 worth of clothing at a time, so it was a different kind of thing. So I went from selling $9.99, $9.99 shoes to $999 shoes.
Wow.
And it was an amazing thing. But ultimately, the customer is the customer. And was I helping, bridesmaids find, shoes for their wedding at $9 each, or was I helping the bride find a $10,000 pair of shoes for a one-of-a-kind occasion? So either way, it was the same kind of thing. But that helped me when I came into dentistry, looking at treatment planning, looking at how to talk to patients about these large cases that we were doing, and we're talking about in the 90s, but also talking about the things that people didn't want to do, like SRP, the things to convince somebody that they needed that they didn't really want. That also, from my retail background, helped me a lot.
Yeah. And so, but you have a really cool story too about how did you make that jump into dentistry? Because dentistry, that's a weird thing to move into. If you didn't go through, maybe dental school or whatever, how do you even get into it?
Well, the big reason is because, my dentist married my sister. So I went from, seeing this guy at Thanksgiving to having to go into the office, and when he originally asked me to help him, I thought, hey, I love teaching people about customer service. That was one of the things I really enjoyed doing. And I said, sure, let me stop by and help you one day. And the answer to that was, well, it won't be for one day. What I'd like you to do is come to this Perio surgery course with me and learn dentistry. so that you can come help me in my practice. And I had no idea, but I was excited about making the change. And literally from the time we drove back from that perio surgery meeting, I quit retail. I was done. Sight unseen. I'd never worked a day in dentistry, and it was literally a light switch moment. But those are the kind of leaps that I like to make. I've done that a million times in my career. And this is 33 years in dentistry after a long period of time outside of dentistry. So I like making those leaps because, you never know what you don't know over the other side of that cliff,
For sure. For sure. Did you start out as like an office manager, or were you just consulting with them on like how to get the crew into place?
Well, no, I started directly at the front desk. I mean, when I made the leap, it was, there is nobody at the desk. I need you to take over. And I think a lot of people have gone through this where you're thrown into this job in dentistry. You have no idea what you're doing. I equate this to a Monster ad, Monster or job, one of those jobs online where the ad says, come run my $1 million business, no experience necessary, and the girls will teach you how to run it. So, I jumped into this $1 million business and I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm sending out insurance claims that have real big legal ramifications. All these things that I'm doing, and I had no idea what I was doing. Literally by picking up a few books on the shelf and by talking to the other girls in the office. I'm sorry I don't put it that way, but that's the way it was kind of explained to me. The girls will teach you. And that's really how I came into dentistry. I was the immediate student, and I continue to be a student of dentistry every single day, learning it.
What a pain point for just like so many practices out there. Like, because that really is how it is. And I would even say on the clinical side of it, it's also very similar. Like if you're a dental assistant in Washington State and you just came from being a bartender and now you're going to be in, taking, x-rays on a patient, well, they'll teach you in the back. Yeah. You'll figure it out when you get back there.
Yeah.
And the way you framed it is like, this is a $1 million practice. And by the way, here's the keys, don't crash my Porsche. Like that is intense.
Yeah. And the crazy thing was, at least my brother-in-law was the consummate student and teacher. Mm-hmm. So when I would question a procedure, he would make me do the procedure. I mean, literally, I'd have the first extracted tooth that I had to do a root canal on. I learned to do injections with an apple. I did all that kind of stuff because he said, if you're going to question how long it takes me to do a procedure, you need to learn the procedure.
Oh, yeah.
So I was thrown in. Yeah.
So over your years, what ended up becoming your passion to help other people do and to figure out?
Honestly, it started, biblical reference. It started from building the house on rock and not sand. And it started with Perio because that was my first course. And, I said, I understand Perio now. And I tell this story now, and my mom is 94, and she would kill me if she knew I tell this story, but she doesn't listen to anything I do in dentistry. But
she listens to this podcast. She already texted me. Don't worry about it. Sorry.
My mom had a full denture at 22.
Wow.
And it was because of Perio. And that, I didn't realize it later on. And again, these things I go back to. As a kid, I would be going to the periodontist with her and sitting as a kid, going with my mom and sitting in the waiting room of these doctor's offices. I did that all through my life, and I didn't realize that until later, that my mom had gone to the dentist all this time, and I would sit with her, and I didn't realize she was going through these treatments. She'd gone through surgery, osteosurgery, and a lot of other stuff, and eventually lost her teeth, which back in the day, we're talking the 60s and 70s, was a kind of a common thing. So I went through that with her and never realized it until later on when I actually met her periodontist at a meeting. And when he heard my name, he said, I know your mother. And, less than a HIPAA issue, but, he said, I know your mother. And he said, I remember you used to come in the office. And it was one of those weird things, but I think I've always been focused on Perio. But it's become a passion because as a office manager, as somebody who sat chairside, it was also some of those things that was the least likely for somebody to say yes to.
Yeah.
And for me, learning how to get past yes was always a big passion. And for crowns and bridges and implants and all that stuff was simple. But Perio was one of those things where there was this wall of, Perio wasn't that important. My gums have always bled. My parents have, it was one of those things where it wasn't a logical thing to get past. So that was one of the passions for me to get past.
The patients don't see the value sometimes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I feel like because you've had that experience though, growing up, even if you didn't recognize it in the moment though, you could come back and rely on that experience later on. I feel like so many dental professionals have had perfect teeth their whole life, right? Like you think about those really good, motivating speakers, so many of them actually went through the problems of, dental problems or whatever, that they can relate to the patient. So how do you get someone who maybe doesn't understand like where the patient is coming from to be on the same page as them? I feel like that's one of the ultimate hurdles.
Well, for me, what I found, and I'm a big statistics hog, so I love stats. And my thing is, I always ask the hygienist in the office when I work with an office, I ask the hygienist the first thing, do you believe in what you do? And of course, the answer is yes. And I go, so let's look at the stats of the office, and let's look at how many adults came in and how many adults had hygiene-related services, and of those hygiene-related services, of those service codes, how much are Perio and how much are Profi? And everybody does this. But then I talk about, have you ever gone through a soft tissue management program? And they all say yes, everybody's been through some program. And for me, a lot of those programs are about how do we get the patient to pay for it and not about how do we get it to be treated. And I think that's where the separation happens in coaching and consulting with hygiene is people start to focus on money. And I always do it this way, and nobody can see it because we're not on video. But people focus on pockets, and I'm pointing to my pant pockets, and not pockets pointing to the pockets in my mouth. And I think for me, it's all about calibrating the office about a clinical outcome than about a financial outcome, which then gets us the financial outcome. So if I can help an office to start, this is crazy, but the first thing I talk about when I work with an office is, let's cut the price of SRP. Cut it in half. All right, this is crazy, but the average SRP is $250, all right? As a patient, I'm not paying $1,000 for something I don't believe in, quote unquote. My gums didn't bleed until the hygienist started sticking me with that needle. I've heard that a million times, right? So how do we switch that? And for me, if I can cut the price of SRP to $150, $125, I can get my patients to say yes, and I get my hygienist not to think about the cost of treatment, which is crazy, but it is a barrier to entry. And now we have the patients who are getting the services that we believe in, and we have patients who actually are now healthy. We get them in a perio cycle, we get them in perio maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. And we break down that barrier where the front office is fighting with the back office. Oh, we didn't do SRP, so we can't do perio maintenance. Oh, you're billing for these bloody profis. And I can get past those things. So a lot of what I do is anti-coaching and consulting, because that's what the larger world does, and get back to, let's talk about perio excellence. Let's talk about healthy gums and all that kind of stuff. And this is from somebody who I haven't picked up a scaler in my life, so I don't know one from another. But I do know outcomes, and that's about healthy patients and healthy financials, and putting those two things together.
Do you find that when you change tweak those little things, that it's going to be exponential success right away, or is this something that is a long process of change?
I think it depends on the longevity of the patients in the practice, because it can't be a light switch if your patients are going to say, "Oh my God, you guys must have went to a course,"
Yeah.
But if it's a new practice and this becomes the new procedure and protocol for the practice, it could be a light switch moment. If it's an older practice, it's going to take time to get those patients to realize it, because we've always done it that way.
Sure.
But it's the right thing for our patients, and it can be something where we can make it an immediate thing. But I think a gradual change is still a good change. Dentistry is a 40-year haul for most practices, 40-year cycle for each provider. So I think if we can set it that way, the outcome, it is a light switch moment, because we've changed what we did in the past.
So even if we do get these acceptances, I still feel like, clinician to clinician, doctor to hygienist, we still maybe don't always, even with the new AAP classification system, I feel like we're not always on the same page for who is a perio patient and what things we need to be assessing. What are you seeing out there along those lines?
It is the curse of dentistry that we all want to be different. You know, I am the most rigid person in the world when it comes to different things, but at the same time, I realize there's a patient involved. So that's why, this is why I came up with StatCheck. This is why I came up with a lot of the protocols that I do in my office. This is why I came up with Crew, because I don't think we all are a team. We don't all get together and hug. We all have different personalities. My idea is forget team and let's start talking crew. We all get in the boat, we all row. When we get off the boat, we can all do our own things. You know, I don't need to hug you as long as when we're on the boat, we're doing the right thing. And that's the idea behind Crew. But for StatCheck, and that's my Perio protocol, it really clearly defines if this, then that, if this, then that. And it classifies, and I guess the AAP has finally come around to listening to what I told them years ago. sorry. But I think when we realize that the classifications have to not only meet the criteria for clinical outcomes, but they also have to meet what a patient understands about periodontal disease. Mm-hmm. So when I came up with I didn't, but when I worked with a team to come up with StatCheck, so I was just the guy who kind of came up with the protocols for StatCheck. But when we all got together and we started talking about clinical outcomes, and this was a psychologist, this was a periodontist, this was a GP, this was myself, this was somebody who was a business director for one of the big dental companies. The five of us got together, and when we created StatCheck, the idea was, let's take those criterias and let's break those down into alphabetical outcomes. So A, symptomatic, B, bleeding, C, calculus, sub G, calculus, D, depth or disease, and F, failing. And if we can take the mouth as we bill it, that was my part of it, the billing part of it, how do we take those classifications, put it into billing protocols? So A's are going to be our asymptomatic patients and they get prophies. Our B's are going to be our bleeding patients, and now we actually have a code for that. So our 4346, we have our C's, which are calculus, and we're going to scale, remove the calculus. The D's are the depth, and there's going to be site-specific anti-infectives possibly needed for that patient, but typically scaling and root planing. And then their F's are those are refractory patients or failing patients who we send to the periodontist for treatment. But it's so easy because now it's a language that our patients can understand. They understand that over bleeding points and suppuration and pocket depths, because a 10 is, if we watch Dancing with the Stars, a 10 is a good thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But classifying those quadrants so that we can bill, so that we can get paid, so that we're consistent, so that no matter who the hygienist is and no matter who the doctor is, we can all get on the same page.
Now, when you go into a practice and you're helping to implement StatCheck, there's always going to be that one or two who are not aligned. How do you help the team to get aligned?
I have a sign. I wish you could see it. It's actually in front of my camera, but it says, either the crew changes or you change the crew. And this is where I come from, because if you've got these people who are pushing back, they're going to push back on everything. And again, that's the patient who, and years ago when I worked in a practice, and when our doctor started talking about implants, there might have been a hygienist there who said, you know what, you could probably just do a 3-unit bridge instead of doing that implant thing. It's the same thing. If we're going to have pushback and dissension amongst the people in the practice, then we don't have the right people on the boat. And yes, I have that all the time. I've had offices where the entire office has quit, and I put that in air quotes, has literally quit because I was hired. But then they come back, because it was just a power struggle. A lot of it is they just are. Everybody wants to feel that they are in control, and everybody wants to feel like they know more than Andre does, or they know more than the doctor knows, or more than Becky, the hygienist, knows. Whatever. Mm-hmm. It really is just about answering some of the questions. Why do you feel that way? What's the problem? And a lot of times when I hear that, it's pushback because they say the doctor's never going to follow through on this new product. Honestly, that's what I hear all the time.
That's true, though. It's so true. Yeah. That's what we feel.
Yeah. He comes in every couple of weeks with this new thing he learned at a course, and we do it for 3 or 4 weeks, and then we're done.
Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of that pushback is like, let's just stick to status quo. That's what management's all about, sticking to the status quo.
I like that mentality though, Andre, because I feel like some people would say that's a little bit harsh. Like if
Sure.
you're not going to be on the crew, then you're not going to be on the crew, right? We're going to help you off the crew. But if you really think about it, we kind of do the same thing for our patients though, right? So if we go through this stat check and we find that, okay, this is going to be a Perio protocol, and the patient's like, give me a prophy. We're not going to do it either, right? Like, no, you'll get on the boat with us, or you can go find a different boat because we're not going to do that for you, right? So I feel like it's actually quite aligned with what we want for clinical outcomes. I think about these, there's definitely been in, my career of working with DSOs, there's been a lot of changeover from certain offices, and we move people around from one office to another for certain types of fit. And when you do that, sometimes they don't love that until they figure out, why are we doing what we're doing? And then they embrace it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I think about in 30 something years of doing this, I've been, I do, again, I'm a stats guy. So I've been in an office, 1 to 2 offices a week for 32 years. So I've seen everything. From 2 operatories to 26 operatories, from multi-locations to single locations, from philosophy of yank it out to let's restore the whole thing. I see it all, and honestly, it's really about clinical philosophy of practice starts first. And if we get everybody on the same page towards that philosophy, then everything else works. I look at every business out there, and you could have a McDonald's focused practice where it's just about churn out the burgers and turn over employees on a regular basis. Or you could have, Ritz-Carlton ideas of we work for our customer, we work for our employees, we work for that. Either way, the clinical outcomes have to be good. Even if you're churning through patients, you still have to have pretty good clinical outcomes. And I don't know, I have never met a dentist who performs a procedure expecting that they're not doing it the best that they can. I've never found that to be the issue. It's always about the business is churning and the philosophy is not followed. That's where the two separate. So I always work on making those two things fall together so that the mission of the practice, philosophy of the practice, and the processes of the practices align.
So let's go back to the A, B, C, D, F. Okay, so let's say that we're a practice that we want to embrace, and this kind of comes back to Tameka's point too, is if we're all trying to be aligned with this, is stat check something that's just like a handout that gets scanned into the patient chart? Is it actually within the patient chart somewhere? Like, how do we implement this from like the patient to patient perspective?
Yeah. Well, we started the stat check with the idea that everybody has a full, when I say full, I mean full Perio chart. I'm talking 6-point probing, I'm talking gingival margin, I'm talking furcation, I'm talking mobility, I'm talking the whole thing. I don't want to just see pocket depths on a chart. So I want a full charting, I want a FMX, all right? And from that, we can break that down by quad into that letter grade. So really what stat check is just a understanding within the office that we can then give to the patient of the diagnosis of what we see in a full charting. So nothing changes from our AAP scores or anything else. There's nothing different about stat check. Stat check is just the language to interpret the pockets, the bleeding, the suppuration, et cetera, into a patient speak. So that's what I tell people all the time. They're like, oh, good, this is like PSR, so we can get faster. No, it's not. It is not. I don't want you to do a PSR score unless you do a full charting that gives you that PSR score. Mm-hmm. I don't want you to do a stat check unless you're doing a full probing. This is not a sweep. This is not anything else. This is taking the information and then interpreting into patient speak. I always said, if my patient said to me, I need a cap, well, heck, we're going to give you a cap. It's going to be made out of zirconia, and it's going to be a beautiful cap, but it is a cap in your world. I don't care. It's still $1,500. So, it is an interpretation of that full charting. So it does help the offices to get on the same page and everybody to understand the full scope of the charting.
So Andre, once a patient has accepted treatment and they're on their maintenance, how does stat check apply when a patient is on perio maintenance? Or I know Andrew and with your years of experience, sometimes patients have to get retreatment, rescaled. How does that apply with stat check?
Well, it's actually easier for me because a lot of the patients who we had going through our stat check program actually looked at it almost like a report card. And actually, when we originally designed the program, we actually had a paper report card that patients would carry. And they would actually compete with spouses to say, hey, my husband came and he was a CB, left side was C, the right side was B. What am I? And, of course, my answer was always, well, you're kissing the guy, so you're going to be the same score on a regular basis until we get you both healthy. But we would actually have patients competing with grades, almost like school grade kids, to get better. But now understanding that, hey, you went from an A or B back down to some C's because maybe you weren't doing the water pick like we talked about. Maybe you got a Sonicare, but you were just brushing with it. So we could actually go back to conversations about health, but using the stat check as a score. And people love the idea that they could actually, like we did back in the 1980s and 90s with getting patients to get a higher dental IQ. Patients got involved in the care because they understood it. We weren't talking dental language. We were talking a language that was common for both dentistry and patients. So stat check actually helped them to understand where they were. And if it failed a little bit more, or, the grades didn't get as well, then we got them to do more homework and got better.
So with a perio maintenance patient, they can not be inflammation, but they'll still have bone loss. Can they go back to an A or?
In theory, because they're asymptomatic.
Okay.
So in theory, and again, I always use this example, a hygienist who at one time had a 10 millimeter pocket may be able to keep that area clean. There's no disease activity. There's no more. And again, if we've arrested, using that term, if we've arrested the disease, theoretically, that person could be asymptomatic and go back to a prophy. It's not the norm. Clinically, that's not what we see. But typically what happens is people go from a B to a C. Again, they're retaining more calculus, that kind of stuff. But they won't go to a D where there's disease activity. But most adults can go from that C area where there's calculus back to a B, where there's bleeding points, but we can still maintain it. And again, they typically stay in a perio maintenance cycle, 49-10 for coding, throughout their lives. It's rare that we would see somebody go to an A from a B. Maybe site specific, but again, that's where I'm not locked into this is the code, but this is the diagnosis, and we bill for what we find.
Yeah, like a big picture philosophy.
As a clinician, that kind of perks up because of we know we see stages of periodontal disease that go just like this. One day they come in, they're doing great, good job, keep it up. Next day, what happened?
Yeah.
3 months down the line, what's going on? So me as a clinician first, that makes me perk up. Like, what?
Yeah.
So I feel like, Andre, in our appointments, you talked about the 80s and 90s and, getting our patients to buy into, treatment being a part of all of this conversation. And I feel like we have been shortening appointments as the decades have gone on. Mm. How do you see this? I imagine it takes a few minutes to explain the few minutes that we don't have generally in an appointment. So how do we get this implemented?
For me, stop shortening your appointments. All right. Honestly,
sold.
If I go in an office and the first thing they say to me is, how can we get down to 30-minute appointments, 45-minute appointments? I go, I guess I need to go back to the airport. For me, I need an hour with a patient, minimum adult. And when I talk adult, I'm just talking about our second molars present or not. So, for me, it's an hour appointment. And when I'm doing SRP, it's a 90-minute appointment. If I'm seeing a kid under 14 or even 12, then I'm talking about a 30-minute appointment. I think scheduling like Lego bricks. If you go to the dollar store and you buy a Lego brick, it's not going to work with the Lego bricks that you have. They're just not going to snap together properly, and that's the way I see scheduling. They all have to snap together properly, and they have to be consistent. And don't tell me, well, we need an hour and 10 minutes. Well, that's bogus. I mean, it's a 60-minute appointment. Make it work. A lot of times what I find is that offices that squeeze the appointment time are losing the juice out of the patient. The example I give is always about oranges. If you're an orange grower and you squeeze an orange, but you're not using the full force to squeeze it, you're leaving juice in there. All right. For me, I'm squeezing that juice out. I'm selling the seeds to a seed company. I'm selling the rinds to somebody who makes potpourri or whatever. I'm getting every bit I can out of a patient, and I'm going to do that within that hour appointment.
I love that. I love that answer. Hope all the business owners are listening to that right now.
That's
yeah.
true.
And they're cringing because sometimes they're thinking more is better, but this isn't Walmart. We can't do that.
Right.
All right. And like I said, I worked in the environment where I sold $9.99 shoes, and I worked a 10-hour day and I made $1 million. And I've worked in a retail space where I could sell $1 million in a day. So do you want to sell Rolls Royces or do you want to sell Chevys?
Yeah. So one last question for you, Andre. We typically end the show with asking kind of like, hey, do you have any last words for like new grads or recent grads or someone that's going to be coming into the profession that may not have heard all of the things that we've heard? Like, Tameka and I have been doing this for a bit. What information can you give to them?
First thing I always say is, it's kind of trite, but know thyself. I mean, honestly, figure out who you are, what you want to do, what are your, I start everything with philosophy. Come up with what is your clinical philosophy, and don't budge from it until you get to another stage of clinical philosophy. Once you learn something new, that will change. But learn who you are, learn what your clinical philosophy is, and then treat towards that. And the rest of it will happen. I never expected to be where I am in this world, but I knew where I wanted to be, and all the other things have fallen into place, So treat towards your clinical philosophy, and the rest of it sort of all works. But define that first. Define who you are as a clinician first, and everything else will work out.
I love that. Where can they find you, and talk a little bit about your show that you have? So,
best way to find me is thecrewprocess.com, which is my website. And because I'm retired, I do a lot of these kind of crazy projects. And one of the things that I just started, and it's just a fun project, was I started interviewing like this a lot of my friends in the dental field. And I started doing this recording called The Fork in the Road, because just like I hit this fork in the road where I went from retail to dentistry, a lot of my good friends in dentistry have hit that fork. And I always like to understand what helped them to make that change. And let's talk about going back to that fork and talk about who you were and what you discovered during that process. So that's a new project I did, and it's on my YouTube channel, which is just go to YouTube and type in my name and you'll find me. Type Andre Shirdan and you'll find those videos. And that's just been a fun project I've been working on.
I know you say it's a bit like a fun project, but it's actually very powerful. I've watched a few of those episodes, and it hits you. Like some of them, you're like, "Whoa, where did that come from?" Like that was me back in the day. Like it's very, very well done, and and a little bit from the technical side, I love your editing on that one. I love how you bring in the different books that someone mentioned, or the thoughts that you highlight certain aspects of it. So it's very as a viewer, very friendly to my eyes, and it kind of appeals to all my senses. So I appreciate. Hopefully, you'll keep doing that, because it's an amazing show. So
thank you.
Thank you, Andre, for being here. Thank you for sharing all the things. Thank you, Tameka, for being here as well.
Thank you.
And have a great day.
Yeah, this is a tale, oh yeah, a tale of two hygienists. So there might be only one, bringing the best of dental knowledge, and we do it all with ease. We cover oral health and screening, and preventing gum disease. We're gonna do a lot of learning, and have a little bit of fun working at the dentist. A tale of two hygienists.